to say there are 4 contributors to this panel. 3 of them are here in person, and one, Jamie Draper, is with us on Zoom. So I'll briefly introduce each of the contributors before their talk, and then they have around 15 minutes for their presentation. And Emily gave me strict timekeeping instructions, so I made little things to hold up. So I'll do my best there. And then after all the presentations, we'll have some time for questions and discussion. So our first speaker is Michelle Meyer. She's the director of the Hazard Reduction and Recovery Center here at Texas A&M, where she's also an associate professor of landscape architecture and urban planning in the College of Architecture. She researches the intersections of hazards and gentrification using the lens of social capital to understand how relationships between individuals, governmental, and non-governmental organizations affect risk and recovery for marginalized populations. Her paper this afternoon is called, let me check she didn't change it, yeah. Irregular Disaster to Continually Crisis, the Altruistic Community Under Climate Change. Michelle.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Glasscock Center, for having me here and allowing me to share my work with you today. A little caveat to begin with, I'm a social scientist. I'm a sociologist by training, and I work in urban planning. And I very much enjoy my time here chatting with humanities folks. But I am a bit of an odd duck, but I will promise I reduce the number of models and statistical tables in my presentation today. So don't worry about that. I also wanted to add an additional assumption here that my presentation here, we're focused on acute crises or acute disasters, hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, with the understanding that these are more common and more damaging due to the climate crisis that we're facing. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started here. So this photo was taken in 2013 when I was visiting Sri Lanka as a newly minted PhD student. I was the social scientist with a team of engineers to go understand what Build Back Better meant in Sri Lanka 9 years after the tsunami affected that country. So now, of course, the caveat, earthquakes and tsunamis are not climate hazards, but some of the recovery processes you'll see began my thought process for what I'm going to talk about today. So in Sri Lanka, as they were doing their recovery, they split the process into 2 programs. One was called owner-driven, and one was called donor-driven. So owner-driven is what we think about here in the US. An individual who owns a home on their own land that they also own, use their own money or resources to rebuild that home on their own land. Owner-driven. Donor-driven was the much larger program for this country, which is a very low income, and where a lot of the people affected by the tsunami were fishers who lived on the beaches in very small, kind of temporary type housing, and then would work from the shore. These folks were left to rely on international non-governmental organizations who came in and built homes or condos, as you might see here. And the government helped kind of allocate these to the survivors of the disaster. Now, these are some other examples of what it looked like here. Right? The more we looked, the more we saw these everywhere. So as you noticed on the previous slide, we have condos that are meant to be there and people are meant to live in them for a long time, has the Red Cross logo on the outside from that tsunami. As we looked at there's 3 different houses here, 3 different complexes, and I added the arrows there. It's not quite as big, but we noticed there's a little plaque on every donor-driven house to say it was donated by what nonprofit, and then it was for a survivor of the tsunami. Now this tags you obviously as being unable to pay for your own recovery, right? That you're at the mercy of the nonprofits to do this. Now, the other issue that really interested me, though, and that I found really fascinating at that time, was the sheet of paper up here in the corner. The sheet of paper is a certificate. It's not the title or deed to the house. It's a certificate saying, if you live in the house for 10 years, then we will give you the title or deed. So these individuals would get a free house if they or someone from their family lived in that house for 10 years. They weren't allowed to resell it immediately. That was the fear. They might get the house, resell it, make a profit off of it, move somewhere else. They wanted these folks to live in these houses specifically, and they had to wait 10 years after they moved in to be able to get the title and deed for the house. So of course this affected their agency of being able to choose where they wanted to live. Some of these were, the Red Cross one was a couple blocks from the shore. These other ones, 2 to 3 hour commute now to the shore to try to do fishing, which was their livelihood, which then people were choosing. Do I keep a free house or do I go back, live closer to the shore, and make money? So at that time, I remember thinking, this is really unusual. We wouldn't see this in the US. Well, that's not true. So as I came back to the US and began digging into long-term recovery and looking at what happens in the US, we often like to think that people who aren't involved in the disaster world thinks that FEMA comes back in and they'll make you normal again. And by no stretch of the imagination is FEMA ever going to make you normal again or any other sort of governmental aid. So what happens after that, what they call unmet needs, are met by nonprofits. So here, this is a part of an article by Samaritan's Purse, where they're describing a community that they built. They bought the land, and then the Mennonite Disaster Services built the house with their own money and volunteer labor, and then they gave the houses over to survivors of Harvey. And this is in LaGrange, Texas, which is a small town outside of Austin. And if you notice, we have a plaque on the side of our house as we have the dedication and give that house away. So this, we see LaGrange is a small town, less than 10,000 people. And I saw this across community, across community, across community, that we have these processes going on. And they too had these same discussions of how long should we keep the title? We don't want people to just profit off of this and move somewhere else. We want them to stay here. They need to stay here and benefit from this nice house that we gave them. So many of these nonprofits decided different timeframes. It usually wasn't 10 years, but they might make them hold the title for a couple years before they gave them the title and full ownership of the house. So as I started seeing these things, I couldn't stop seeing it. So that brought me to my current grant, which looks at what are known as long-term recovery groups. So my current grant is trying to find all these groups across the country, and these groups bring together a variety of nonprofit organizations to try to use a case management approach to find each person's needs and then bring all those donated resources to fulfill those needs. So in our research from 2010 to 2019, we found 432 of these long-term recovery groups. They're usually at a county level, serving a county rather than a city themselves. And over that decade, they covered about 15% of all U.S. counties were covered by a long-term recovery group. And in this picture, the pink ones are states that had a state-level long-term recovery group versus having smaller ones, or sometimes they had it in conjunction with smaller ones. Now, what's even more interesting over time, we see these increasing dramatically, right? And so we can think about, we have 2005, we have post-Katrina, and this is when FEMA and the National Voluntary Organizations Active with Disaster started really talking about you needed to do case management for survivors so that we could reduce the duplication of benefits so that nobody got benefits twice, so that we could be more efficient with our disaster aid dollars. So we saw them starting to put out promotional materials, convincing communities to create long-term recovery groups. And the kind of first documents for those came out in 2011 and 2012, and we've seen a steady climb in these organizations over time. Now, this kind of goes to, so what, right? We have long-term recovery groups, they're building houses, that's a good thing post-disaster. We're getting people back into homes. So, this brings us to a discussion of inequity, right? who are the individuals who are going through this process, this donor-driven recovery in the US, right? These are our most marginalized populations, right? If we think back to at the global scale, obviously the US, we are the emitters of greenhouse gas emissions, and we don't have as much of the burden as the rest of the world. But within the US, we still are seeing these great inequalities of who is going to be affected worst by the climate disasters that are increasing in frequency and strength. Right, so we see across the bottom here, these larger homes. While they're not recovered yet, this is from Mayfield, Kentucky's tornado in December, they're more like what I would end up going through a disaster. I'm faculty here at A&M. I have a steady job, a good income. I own my home. I own my lot that my home is on. And I have insurance, financial resources, family. I would be going through an owner-driven recovery process. Now, what we have on the top, we have smaller homes. We have homes that were already demolished and people might end up just living in RVs for a long time. And we even have the case of potentially mobile homes that could be owned, but not own the land that they're on, right? So those are a unique situation that further complicates this. And the LaGrange study that I showed you a minute ago here, that's who they were putting in those homes, were people who had lived in mobile homes before, but didn't actually own any land in that community. Right? And then also we know from disaster research, the people who take the longest time to recover here are going to be low income, underinsured, uninsured, as well as people who are renters, right? Because remember I said it's owner-driven versus donor-driven, right? So if you're a renter, you automatically are going to end up more in that donor-driven category, right? So when we looked at the county level of those long-term recovery groups and thought about inequity and aggregate, right? Some of the things that we saw in our model was that obviously long-term recovery groups form where there's a lot of disasters. But they also form where there's a lot of people, right? So we get these groups rising in counties that have higher populations, right? So more of a little bit of an urban tendency for these long-term recovery groups to pop up. And that urban tendency coincides with there's actually a higher percentage of minorities in these communities the long-term recovery groups occur in, as well as people living below the poverty line. So it seems like they are aiming or in communities where they could help a greater percent of those folks. The two things that we didn't expect was that they are not in communities that have higher elderly populations or higher populations of persons with disabilities. Those are two areas that because that's two areas that long-term recovery groups really target as very vulnerable people, are those who are elderly or have disability, right? So this, to me, points to that we have long-term recovery groups forming in areas where there's more quantitative need, right? More numbers of people in need, rather than more disproportionate need, county to county. But if we dig down in looking at within one disaster. I'll use this example this is West Texas, an hour and a half north of here. They had a disaster in 2013. In our study from that disaster, we went back each year for 3 years to see what houses were rebuilt on what lots. By year 3, over 80% of the houses were rebuilt. There was something reconstructed on the lot. But there was another 11% that were vacant lots. So they had demolished the home, but never rebuilt. And then another 2% that the home was still damaged and not recovered. And this is another small town that also had a long-term recovery group and also had federal aid. And we have this kind of longer process of getting there. The biggest predictor of whether they were recovered or not at the end of 3 years was how the dollar value of the assessment on the house. So more expensive, higher value houses were back much quicker than the houses that were lower value. So houses more like we have this stone facade, a larger kind of suburban home, those got back quickly. We also noticed that if they weren't really back in year 1, it became very unlikely that they were going to be rebuilt after that. So we saw those changes happening even in these very small towns. Now, to turn from kind of a quantitative analysis and statistical numbers, I spent a lot of time in these long-term recovery groups, at their meetings, talking with their officials. And so this is a little bit on the discourse of how they talk about aid and how they talk about inequality. So, and it really it gets at that they are thinking very much right now about this disaster, getting us back to exactly what was in the community beforehand, not thinking about the historical legacy of marginalization or the historical processes that got us here in the first place. So we have things where they advocate for providing free houses by calling it workforce housing. So you don't want your workforce, you don't want your minimum wage workers, you need them at Walmart, they will say, we can't have them leave the community, so we need to build them free houses. So instead of saying we're building affordable housing or public housing, they say we're building workforce housing. And of course, this frames them in terms of their use, right, to someone else in the community, not their right to return to their community on their own, right? They talk about a thing called deferred maintenance. If the house had damage before the disaster, right, then made the disaster worse, that's a big problem because they're there to fix the problems from the disaster, not the problems that existed beforehand. So if something had deferred maintenance, say you had a leaky roof, they're not going to repair that leaky roof. If your roof got totally blown off during the disaster, they'll give you a new roof. But a leaky roof, they're not going to address that, right? Again, it has to be damage from this disaster. So they won't help someone who's homeless before the disaster, only if they're homeless because of the disaster. And then we have this interesting discussion between client and survivor, right? They want to call people clients of their services, not survivors or victims of the disaster, right? And the client makes it seem like they have a choice in getting that service for a house, but they're there because they have no financial resources and nowhere else to turn to get housing. And then the final one is that it is most likely still with these groups, the easiest thing for them to do is to rebuild for homeowners on owned lots, right? They have a much harder time with renters. Where do we put them? How do we find a lot for them? Or people who didn't have a lot beforehand, those are much more complicated. They want to turn them into homeowners. So if they had the capacity, maybe they do some homeowner training for them to try to turn them into homeowners rather than putting them back. So real quickly here, some of the issues in coming forward as we reach greater climate change, right? This is all large foundations. They're disaster aid from the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, and it's compared to FEMA money. So FEMA money is in yellow, disaster philanthropy is in blue, right? So we can see that the disaster philanthropy money overall for any type of disaster need is about a 1 to 4 with what FEMA pays out, right? And that in some places, like Texas, it's bigger than what FEMA pays out, right? Now, this is across any phase of the disaster, right? But we often like to pay out money for things that are sexy, like rescue, right? We often want to feed people. We don't want to build houses, right? So if we switch over to look at just recovery and reconstruction, it dwindles dramatically, right? The majority of our aid money is going to immediate response. It's not going to mitigation. It's not going to rebuilding homes. It's not going to addressing the long-term climate crisis that we're in. It's going to these very acute needs in an acute phase, right? And we see here that now the philanthropy to FEMA dollars is a 1 to 3 ratio, right? And this is their quote there that we have from CDP, that over a third of private giving is done in less than the first 4 weeks of a sudden disaster and 2/3 within 2 months. This giving stops almost completely after 5 or 6 months. And those nonprofits that get it, they're gonna spend it as soon as they get it, right? So we're not rebuilding houses. And for an example here in the US, this photo was taken in Mayfield, Kentucky over spring break, so March, the one on the left over there. And if you notice, those are donated water bottles from their December tornado, right? After disaster, we all want to send water bottles, we all want to send food, and they don't get used. Bottled water gets thrown away a lot in disasters. They are serving a purpose here, I guess. They're holding up the temporary fence around the courthouse, so that's good. But we're 3 months post-disaster, and nobody needed that water. What they need, is this photo drawn by an elementary school girl in West Texas, they need more houses, right? But our second issue is then with coming climate crisis, but who is going to do this? This again is Mayfield, Kentucky, and these are the churches that usually respond. They lost 90% of their churches during that disaster. So who is going to recover those? And of course, this is our common bar graph of coming climate change and the number of disasters that we're facing. And if we expect our nonprofits to rise up again and our altruistic community to not be tired and overwhelmed and also out of money. And so I'll close with this last photo here. Let me pop to it. It's a little hard to read, but he says, this is the fireplace house I am rebuilding. And then he gives his GoFundMe account so that you can donate to his rebuilding, right? So is this what our altruistic community is going to look like in climate change, right? As we rely more and more on the goodness of our neighbors to try to do massive structural change as we face these challenges. So, thank you.
Thanks very much. So our second speaker is joining us from Zoom. So Jamie Draper's coming from Oxford University, UK. He's a postdoctoral prize research fellow in politics at Nuffield College, Oxford. His research develops a political theory of climate displacement. He's been published in journals such as American Political Science Review and Political Studies, and he's currently working on a monograph on climate displacement. And his paper this afternoon is called Climate Change and Displacement Towards a Pluralist Approach. Jamie.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much for having me here today, and thank you so much to the organizers for all the work that in putting this great conference together. So I've learned a huge amount from all the speakers who we've heard from today and yesterday. So I'm sorry not to be there with you in person, but I'm happy to have the chance to still participate virtually nonetheless. So the paper that I'm going to present today focuses on the topic of climate displacement, that is the displacement of people driven by the impacts of climate change. So we know that the impacts of climate change are reshaping patterns of migration and displacement around the world. So as the most recent IPCC report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability is confirmed once again, climate change impacts such as sea level rise, extreme weather events, and environmental degradation will predictably lead many people to leave their homes and communities over the course of the 21st century. So I'm interested in the normative question of what the context of climate change means for our moral obligations to the displaced. Now, one popular approach to climate displacement in political philosophy focuses on setting out an account of the rights and duties of people displaced by the impacts of climate change, usually identified as climate refugees. And I call this the monist approach to climate displacement. Now, the monist approach is explicitly defended in some proposals made by some lawyers and global governance scholars, but I also think that it's a fairly commonplace way of thinking about climate displacement amongst lay publics, and that it's implicit in much work in political philosophy on climate displacement. And today I want to argue against the monist approach. So in particular, I want to suggest that by focusing on the concept of the climate refugee, the monist approach gets off on the wrong foot. So the concept of the climate refugee obscures two important features of climate displacement: its causal complexity and its heterogeneity. And I argue that this creates what I call a problem of moral arbitrariness. So proposals that focus on the concept of the climate refugee will be morally arbitrary in the sense that they'll fail to treat like cases alike, and the sense that they'll fail to treat relevantly different cases differently. So this argument clears the ground for me to introduce an alternative way of thinking about climate displacement, which I call the pluralist approach. So the pluralist approach shifts our attention away from the concept of the climate refugee. So rather than asking, what do we owe to climate refugees, it directs us to ask a series of more contextually specific questions about what we should do in different contexts in which climate change and displacement interact. So I'll only be able to briefly sketch this alternative today, and my main task will be to show why we should abandon the concept of the climate refugee in thinking about climate displacement. So I think that abandoning this concept opens up new ways for us to think about climate change and displacement. So the monist approach to climate displacement is articulated in a group of proposals set out in recent years that focus on creating a special status, often a legal status and international treaty for so-called climate refugees. And the basic idea of these proposals is that we can pick out a group of people displaced by the impacts of climate change and set out an account of the rights to which those people are entitled. So perhaps the most influential example of this comes from Frank Bierman and Ingrid Boers, who've outlined a proposal for a new legal instrument constituted as a protocol to the UNFCCC called the Protocol for the Protection and Resettlement of Climate Refugees, according to which those who are identified as climate refugees would have rights to planned relocation and resettlement. But different proposals differ in their details. So they pick out different groups of people as climate refugees, they specify different rights and duties associated with climate refugee status, and they take different institutional forms. But despite these differences, they all share one important feature, which is that they take the task of addressing climate displacement to require that we pick out a group of climate refugees as a category of concern and articulate a set of rights to which persons in that group are entitled. So the main motivation for these proposals is that they appear to address what's been called a protection gap in relation to climate displacement. So a protection gap refers to the idea that existing legal frameworks fail to offer protection to some people who have justified claims to protection. So for example, people displaced by climate impacts aren't eligible for protection under the Refugee Convention, which is restricted to people fleeing persecution on the basis of certain protected characteristics. And proponents of the monist approach typically see their proposals as a way of closing the gap in protection for people displaced by climate change impacts. Now, the concept of the climate refugee plays a central role in the monist approach, and I think it's very widespread as well in popular discourse, policy briefs, and in some academic fields. But within migration studies, it's faced significant pushback. So there have been a number of different lines of criticism that have been raised against the concept of the climate refugee, but here I'm just going to focus on one, which is the idea that the concept of the climate refugee obscures two important features of climate displacement, which are stressed in the empirical literature, which are its complexity and its heterogeneity. So by its complexity, I mean the idea that climate change impacts usually interact with many other political, economic, social, demographic, and environmental drivers of displacement. So there are a range of factors that make people more or less vulnerable to climate impacts, often structured around along classic fault lines such as race, class, indigeneity, and gender. And those factors shape who's forced to move, and indeed who's unable to move. And for our purposes, one important upshot of the complexity of climate displacement is that it makes it very difficult to determine with any degree of confidence whether or not someone is displaced by the impacts of climate change, as opposed to any number of interrelated drivers of displacement that have also generally played a causal role. Now, by heterogeneity, I mean that climate displacement takes very different forms in different contexts. So extreme weather events destroy homes, environmental degradation undercuts the viability of livelihoods, sea level rise and coastal erosion force communities to relocate, risks to food and resource security magnify existing sources of political instability. And in each of these cases, displacement has different features. It might be slow or sudden onset, internal or international, predictable or unpredictable, and so on. So the heterogeneity of climate displacement means that different cases may look very different from each other, so that it's hard to identify anything that unites them, apart from their connection, however indirect, to climate change. So to see this, we can consider a few examples. So first, take displacement in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, an extreme weather event of the type that's likely to become more frequent and intense as climate change accelerates. So as Katrina unfolded, its effects were mediated by pre-existing vulnerabilities structured along the lines of race and class. So evacuation messages were less likely to reach or to be trusted by low-income and Black residents in New Orleans, many of whom remained behind because they were concerned that public authorities wouldn't protect their property or because they provided care for somebody who was unable to leave. And the evacuation plan for the city depended on residents being able to leave by car. But of course, rates of car ownership were much lower amongst Black and low-income communities. And as a result, the impacts of the disaster fell most heavily on low-income and Black residents. Now, second, consider outmigration from Mexico to the USA. So at the aggregate level, statistical analyses show that reductions in crop yields relating to climate change have an important causal role in migration from Mexico to the USA. But importantly, other factors have also been identified as having an influence on who moves from Mexico to the USA at the aggregate level, including the relative growth in labor supply over labor demand in Mexico, structural transformations in the Mexican economy as a result of NAFTA, changes in US immigration policy. And so far as we know, in any given case of outmigration from Mexico, this might result from any one of a combination of these factors, as well as, of course, decisions taken by migrants themselves. Now, third, consider the relocation of native communities in Alaska. So in coastal Alaska, the village of Shishmaref has been at risk of coastal erosion since the 1950s, but this risk has been exacerbated by thinning ice, shoreline erosion, severe storms, and permafrost exposure relating to climate change. And the inhabitants of Shishmaref are members of the Inupiat tribe, whose daily lives are intimately bound up with the land that they occupy. And the residents of Shishmaref are seeking relocation within tribal territory, but the relocation process has largely stalled. So distrust between tribal and federal authorities has marred the process, and funding has been an important obstacle. So until recently, legislation governing the activities of FEMA provided only for post-disaster rebuilding of homes, the kind that we've just heard talked about, in their original location after a presidential declaration of a disaster. So in all of these cases, displacement is complex in the sense that multiple factors interact together to produce the displacement or immobility outcome. Often the factors that affect displacement are structured along lines like class, race, and indigeneity and gender, but other factors too also shape displacement outcomes, including the legal and policy context, the structure of labor markets, the built environment. And the difference between these cases also illustrates the heterogeneity of climate displacement. So these cases differ in a number of different ways, and there are a number of different axes according to which we could distinguish them: slow versus rapid onsets, and internal versus international, reactive and proactive, community level, individual level, and so on. Now, the concept of the climate refugee obscures these features of climate displacement. So it singles out one cause of displacement, the impacts of climate change, out of many that are often entangled, and it groups together all those whose displacement can be linked to that cause, regardless of any internal differences within that group. Now, you might well ask, so what? After all, it's not the purpose of the concept of the climate refugee to provide us with a complete and sociologically accurate description of how climate displacement works. So its purpose is to establish a certain set of legal rights and duties for the group of people that it picks out. So by analogy, we might think of the concept of corporate personhood. So the purpose of the legal concept of corporate personhood isn't to represent truths about group agency. It's rather to establish certain rights and duties, like the liability of corporations to be sued in court. Now, I don't think that there's anything objectionable per se about the fact that the concept of the climate refugee doesn't accurately represent these dynamics. But I do think that an approach that relies on that concept in granting rights and duties will inevitably face a problem, which I call the problem of moral arbitrariness. Now, arbitrariness, as I'm using the term here, is about failing to treat like cases alike and relevantly different cases differently. So it's a basic principle of formal equality that says that when there are no morally relevant differences between cases, they should be treated alike, and that where there are morally relevant differences between cases, they should be treated differently in ways that respond appropriately to those morally relevant differences. And my claim is that proposals that center the concept of the climate refugee will fall foul of this principle. So we can take first the claim that the monist approach will fail to treat like cases alike. So here I want to argue that the complexity of climate displacement means that decisions about who counts as a climate refugee will involve a degree of arbitrariness. So the monist approach requires us to be able to identify those who count as a climate refugee and those who don't. And the problem with this is that the empirical finding that climate displacement is complex means that it'll often be difficult to differentiate those whose displacement is caused by climate change from others. Now, this problem has both an epistemic and an ontological aspect. So under the epistemic aspect, the problem is that we might not be able to know when climate change is appropriately singled out as the cause of displacement. So the causal chains that lead from climate change impacts to displacement are messy. It might be beyond our capacities to untangle the threads of causation. Under the ontological aspect, the problem is that it might just not be meaningful to identify climate change as a cause of displacement, which is isolable from other causes, at least in many cases. So the links between climate change and other drivers of displacement are often non-linear, and it's not clear that combined causes can simply be broken down into their constituent parts. So what I think is likely to happen if we try and distinguish between people on the basis of the cause of their displacement here is that at best, decisions will be made about who counts on the basis of how salient climate change is in comparison to other drivers of displacement. And at worst, I think decisions are likely to be made on the basis of the political expediency of making claims about the causal role of climate change, either by laying blame on climate change or by using climate change to avoid blame for kind of pre-existing structural vulnerabilities and so on. Now, the second way in which the monist approach faces the problem of arbitrariness is in its failure to treat relevantly different cases differently. So the problem here is that by lumping together all of those whose displacement can be related to climate change, the monist approach treats the climate displaced as an internally undifferentiated group. But of course, the internal heterogeneity of climate displacement means that different people displaced by climate change in different situations will raise different kinds of normative claims. So for example, on Bierman and Bose's proposal, those displaced by climate change would have rights to permanent resettlement. But that just doesn't seem to fit the situation of many people who are displaced by climate impacts. Think, for example, of those whose homes are destroyed by an extreme weather event who want to go home and rebuild, or those whose livelihood is undermined by changing rainfall patterns who want to be able to work abroad seasonally. And it's worth noting that this isn't just a practical problem, it's a moral problem. So the problem here is that by ignoring this heterogeneity, the monist approach systematically misallocates the rights and duties appropriate for people in different contexts. So that's my negative critique of the monist approach. But what can we learn from this? So my suggestion is that we should adopt what I call the pluralist approach to climate displacement. So the pluralist approach has two basic commitments. First, that climate displacement should be integrated with other non-climate forms of displacement, so that no one's fate hangs on climate change being identified as the cause of their displacement. And second is that climate displacement should be disaggregated. So different approaches will be appropriate for the varied contexts in which climate change and displacement interact. In each context, the task of the theory is to identify the problems that climate change creates for the institutions and practices that govern displacement, and to propose ways of reforming those institutions and practices. So this is what we might call a kind of problem-driven approach to climate displacement. Now, I can't give a full articulation of the pluralist approach today, so let me just end by illustrating what the pluralist approach might look like by providing a preliminary typology of some of the main contexts in which climate change and displacement interact, which seem to me at least to raise different normative considerations. So I'll distinguish between 5 contexts of climate displacement here. So first is community relocation. So in the context of climate change, impacts such as sea level rise, recurrent flooding, and landslides can all create risks that make it difficult for established communities to remain where they are. So the impacts of climate change can often be alleviated by adaptation in situ, at least for some time, but in the long term, relocation might well become necessary. I think in these kinds of cases, questions of procedural justice, questions about who has the power to decide where, when, if, and how a community relocates are often particularly salient. Second is territorial sovereignty. So the habitability of some small island states like Kiribati, Tuvalu, the Maldives, Vanuatu, and the Marshall Islands is threatened in the long term by climate change impacts like sea level rise and coral bleaching. I think this presents a novel challenge to the practices of statehood and sovereignty in the contemporary international order. So the case of small island states requires us to think through the nature and extent of small island people's rights to self-determination, and to think about the ways in which we might reconfigure the practices of statehood and sovereignty in order to protect such rights. Our third is labor migration. So some climate change impacts, such as thawing permafrost, the salination of groundwater, desertification, and recurring floods or droughts, can gradually degrade the environmental background conditions on which people rely for their livelihoods or subsistence. And the evidence suggests that labor migration can sometimes function as a kind of mechanism of adaptation to these conditions at the household level. This raises the question of how states should respond to this kind of trend towards using labor migration as a way of responding to environmental degradation. So whether those states should encourage, permit labor migration as a kind of mechanism of climate change adaptation, and whether those facing climate impacts to their livelihoods or subsistence have claims to forms of in situ adaptation to help them remain where they are, if they so choose. Now, fourth is internal displacement. So sudden onset extreme weather events associated with climate change, flooding, typhoons, hurricanes, wildfires can trigger displacement, usually within a state's borders, but not exclusively. So Michelle has already done an excellent job talking about this. So I'll just say that for political philosophers, I think it's important to think about the status of so-called IDPs, or internally displaced persons. So IDP status, like refugee status, is a kind of normative status that implies a set of rights that its bearer can claim and correlate duties that others owe. But unlike refugee status, IDP status hasn't really received any sustained attention in political philosophy. And so I think we're in need of an account of what we owe to people displaced in these kinds of contexts, and what climate change means for the international duties of protecting internally displaced persons. And finally, fifth is the refugee regime. So sometimes climate change might indirectly contribute to situations in which traditional refugee movement takes place, as in cases where it exacerbates political conflict. But beyond this, there are also likely to be some people who are displaced in refugee-like situations, at least in part due to climate change impacts, but who don't meet the formal conditions for refugee status. So I think in this context, then we need to know who should be eligible for refugee status, what rights refugees have, and what we owe to refugees and those in refugee-like situations who don't meet the criteria for refugee status. So each of these contexts of climate displacement seems to me to raise distinctive normative questions. And my suggestion is that by disaggregating climate displacement, rather than treating those displaced in the context of climate change as a homogeneous group, we can examine these normative questions in their own terms. And in doing so, we don't need to identify any particular individual as a climate refugee. So the figure of the climate refugee, I think by now occupies a significant place in our moral imagination. So Francois Gamend says that climate refugees have become the human face of climate change. Now, my suggestion is that the figure of the climate refugee is a picture in the Wittgensteinian sense. So it's a picture that's held us captive, prevented us from adopting alternative perspectives on climate displacement. This picture of climate displacement, I think, restricts our vision and impedes our moral reflection. And so by dislodging this picture, I hope to enable us to start afresh and to look at climate displacement in a more contextually specific way. So I think I'll leave it there for today, and thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Jamie. So our third speaker this afternoon is Daniel Mahoney. He's a pediatric palliative care physician at Texas Children's Hospital in Houston. As the director of the Texas Children's Medical Humanities program, he facilitates workshops to promote sympathetic care, clinician wellness, and professional identity formation for pediatric trainees and faculty. His paper this afternoon is called Examining Proposed Solutions to Address Human and Planetary Health in the Face of Climate Change. Daniel.
Thank you very much. Is that a little bit better? Thank you very much. All right. So I'm Dan. I'm a pediatric palliative care physician down in Houston. For those of you who aren't familiar with the idea of palliative care, especially with pediatrics, it's a little different than it is with adults. I'm part of an interdisciplinary team, and we provide an extra layer of support to children who have serious illness and their families. Often that's in the setting of a lot of uncertainty and a lot of suffering, usually caused by medical illness, but not always. So that's just sort of the context that we were talking earlier today about our ideological lineage that we come from in our narratives. So that's part of my background. All right. I have no conflicts of interest or financial disclosures today. And I know what Jamie just said, that we should drop the idea of individual climate refugees from our sort of frame of mind, but I didn't have time to redo my slides since his talk, so I hope you'll forgive me. My story here starts actually with Diego's story. And Diego was born in Honduras 3 years ago with a chromosomal abnormality that limits his ability to develop normally. So he can't eat or talk or walk, things that we might expect from other 3-year-olds. When he was born, doctors told his parents, Marco and Yolanda, that he was never going to survive, so better just take him home and let him die. As if that weren't bad enough, home wasn't exactly a great place for any child to be, let alone a child with medical needs. Gang violence made their neighborhood unsafe, food insecurity was always a threat, and after a tropical storm obliterated the already unstable supply of electricity, Marco and Yolanda packed up and headed north. Marco carried Diego, literally on his back, up to the border crossing between Mexico and the United States. When officers saw this ill-appearing, malnourished, developmentally delayed child, they sent the family to the hospital. They were transported up to Texas Children's, which is how my team and I met Diego's family. Marco and Yolanda asked me if I could help. How to even begin to help a family whose suffering arose from so many different types of complex, interconnected systems. Well, my training and my clinical practice are to think outside the box and, as I said, work on an interdisciplinary team. I can't help treat suffering if I don't know how that suffering connects to the rest of a child and family's lives. My job is to help families navigate uncertainty in the face of suffering and often this worsening clinical status. So today, I want to talk a little bit about conflicting complex systems, identify a few leverage points in those systems, and then contextualize that with how we think about climate change as these complex systems are in conflict. We're well acquainted with the problem at this point in the day. There's a narrowing window to enable climate resilient development and lots of opportunities, only some of which are in our control, for us to not succeed. There's only one green path there. There's a lot of other ones that don't end quite as nicely. Humans rely on two very complex systems for their survival and health: the Earth and biosphere and the modern global economic system. These two systems have been on a collision course and remain on that collision course. Diego and Marco and Yolanda are the very real people that are caught in that escalating conflict. What's food got to do with this? Well, I'm a physician. One of our most basic physiologic needs doesn't originate from humans. We can't make our own food. We're not plants. We need, though we might act like it, we are neither immortal nor independent. We can't survive without the planet and the rest of the biosphere, which means any proposed solutions to climate change can't focus only on humans without also including sustainable solutions for the biosphere that we rely on for survival. So let's zoom out and think about some of the different ways that people are trying to remedy the effects of climate change. So all these different specialties and silos and ways of thinking about the world are putting a lot of time and effort and money and resource into addressing these concerns. We have this in medicine too. Every single organ system has its own specialty and their own sort of silo. And what I see from my perspective in palliative care is that this mindset of separate siloed systems is actually part of the problem, because you can't only treat the lungs or the intestines, just as you can't only treat air pollution or food insecurity. They are part of the same system. The reality is that all of the different fields are connected. And to be effective, complex systems like the sciences and the humanities and social sciences are necessarily interdisciplinary, integrated, and relationship-based. Remember when I said that my job was to try and think outside the box? I help families and medical teams to reframe problems, identify the best possible outcome when every option is bad, and try to find non-zero-sum solutions to complicated problems even when there's a lot of uncertainty. That's exactly what Marco and Yolanda asked me to do for Diego. Systems thinking can help us with this process. So this is my very simplified conceptual framework of the complex systems of Earth, biosphere, and humanity. So I should say that a complex system is anything that has a stock of something, like water in a bathtub or microbes in soil or anything like that, and the ability for the system to change over time as things are added or removed from that system. Those would be called flows. Earth is a complex system that supports the biosphere. The biosphere, everything that is alive, is a complex dynamic system constantly evolving. Humans are one very small part of that biosphere. Newton's third law of motion, something that, from what we can tell, applies to every particle in the universe, so I'm going to say that it applies here too, tells us that when two bodies interact, they apply equal and opposite forces to one another. In complex systems, those equal and opposite forces are dispersed, leading to nonlinear feedback. Human actions towards the Earth and the biosphere have led to the changes that we are now seeing: climate change, biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse. But because these systems are so complex, there's a lot of contributing factors to our delay in recognizing signs of that nonlinear pushback. So if we think of human behavior itself, human actions, as the underlying root cause that generated this equal and opposite reaction from the Earth and biosphere, how might we go about changing human behavior? Well, that requires knowing why humans act the way that we do. And the humanities and social sciences are integral to understanding human behaviors and motivations. We can look at proposed climate change solutions through this lens of complex system leverage points, which I'm going to explain in just a minute, and evaluate their likelihood of success or failure based on what we've already learned from the humanities. A leverage point is any place in a complex system where a relatively small change can have an outsized effect on the way that the system behaves or functions. These are ideal places to look if your goal is to try and change a complex system. This is the mental model that I applied to evaluate these proposed climate change solutions through a humanities lens. This list comes from Donella Meadows' 2008 text, Thinking in Systems. We could spend at least an hour covering each one of these, but what's important to remember is that at the bottom, there are a whole lot of ways to impact the system in tiny ways, and at the top, there are very, very few ways to impact the system in huge ways. All right. So how does this relate to the humanities and social sciences? Well, we could examine what history has to say about human paradigms. Thomas Kuhn did this in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. We could look to medicine to see how form follows function, how the physical structure of the body and its systems contribute to its behavior. We could see how the structure of information flows impacts characters in Romeo and Juliet. I only have time to do a couple of these today, so I'm not going to do those. Okay, I'm sorry. What I want to look at today is, what does decision psychology tell us about how negative feedback loops, like carbon taxes and other fees, can incentivize or disincentivize our actions that contribute to climate change? What does sociology have to say about positive feedback loops and how economic proposals to limit positive feedback cycles can flatten the curve of exponential growth? And then history tells us that increased transparency of certain kinds can be helpful to change behavior for both consumers and corporations. So how might that look when trying to protect the environment? All right, I'm going to start off with negative feedback loops here. And I apologize, this is a little bit of the deeper part of things. If I get stuck, I apologize in advance. So decision-making science can offer several reasons why we're exactly where we are today with regard to climate change and not somewhere better. Many of these are related to cognitive biases, predictable ways that predispose humans to make certain decisions that aren't always rational. So if we think about strengthening something like a financial disincentive, like a carbon tax, that'll end up decreasing carbon emissions and encourage corporations to speed their transition to net zero, which is something that is going to be absolutely necessary as we transition and mitigate the effects of climate change. Thaler and Sunstein's book, Nudge, if you haven't read it, I recommend it. It's a delightful read, but they go into exploring examples of climate change from this perspective with a whole lot more examples. But what about weakening negative feedback loops? Well, we already have a lot of strong negative feedback loops in our cities. Taxes, licensing fees, permits are barriers to businesses that may want to provide healthy, locally grown produce in food deserts or food swamps, which are areas defined by their lack of healthy food and the abundance of cheap, unhealthy food. Loosening negative feedback loops by cutting some of that red tape might be able to improve health and nutrition, which, if you'll remember, is at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy. That's one of the most fundamental things that humans need. Urban populations, as we've already heard, are particularly vulnerable as they're often the victims of systemic racism and other inequities, and they're at the greatest risk of worse climate-related health and mortality outcomes. One major limitation to all of these proposed solutions is that they work within the context of this modern global economic system. Remember back to these two big systems on a collision course. Any solution that is going to address economic symptoms without addressing the underlying causes, which are human behavior, human actions, will at best kick the can down the road and at worst accelerate the problem. That's what the US Renewable Fuel Standard did, the goal of which was to use corn ethanol to reduce fossil fuel use. But what it actually did is it incentivized corn ethanol production on industrial farms, increasing fossil fuel use overall. All right, let's switch gears and look at positive feedback loops. 2 years ago, doubling rates and exponential growth curves gained a much broader audience. Everyone was talking about flattening the curve, slowing down the rate of new COVID infections so that the healthcare system's finite resources wouldn't be completely consumed. Some places did this better than others. In natural systems, like in population growth or the spread of infection, there's often strong negative feedback loops that will limit the ability of a positive loop to run out of control, to really hit that exponential growth curve where cases skyrocket. In economic systems, such as colonial capitalism, that are designed to help the rich get richer, progressive taxes and antitrust laws are two ways that'll help to check the economic positive feedback loops that are built into that system and contribute to wealth concentration and social inequality. Two ways to flatten climate change curves are to reduce the rate of resource consumption. I think it was Rose earlier that talked about needing 9 planets just to meet the resource needs of this country going forward. So that it's going to be hard to reduce our resource consumption rate with an increasing size of our global population and striving for an improved standard of living for more members of that population. The other way to think about this is reducing the rate of waste accumulation. So there's a recent law in California to encourage composting food waste. A couple sort of thoughts or limits to these ideas of trying to flatten or reduce the rate of acceleration of these curves. Anything that threatens to slow economic growth is political thin ice and subject to partisan changes. That makes it a much less sustainable solution to these problems. Anything with a nonlinear effect, things like wearing masks or composting food waste, can also be seen as onerous to individuals who don't see the direct links between individual behavior and the desired societal outcome. But there's another positive feedback loop that we don't always tie to climate change. How early in the day do you use and throw away something plastic? Do you ever feel like you need to cut back on the amount of plastic that you use? Do you ever get annoyed or feel guilty if someone calls you out for using a single-use plastic? It isn't hard to screen positive for single-use plastic addiction. I screen positive too. I had my little Keurig coffee and threw it away this morning after I had my coffee. All right. Addiction is a pathological positive feedback loop. We don't have any drugs that are going to help us wean humanity off of plastics, but we have good evidence about how to support people who are recovering from addiction, and we can deploy those skills on a much larger scale than we do currently. Empathy, understanding, rebuilding community, and avoiding triggers are not expensive, but they're not instinctive responses to climate change either. All right, the third example that I want to go through is the structure of information flows. So the purpose of true cost accounting is to inform the consumer of the full non-subsidized costs of something. Information can be a type of feedback loop, and so the way that it is structured can be very powerful. Last summer, the Rockefeller Foundation released a report that looked at the health and climate impacts of food and rolled those costs into the cost of food itself. And they estimated that the true cost accounting of food is 3 times higher than what we pay when we go to the grocery store. The hope is that consumers will think of that true cost the next time that they go and buy food. Now, why do people like this idea of true cost accounting? Well, In decision science and in systems thinking, there's a very frequently cited example of a Dutch housing program that built a whole bunch of nearly identical homes, except half of them had the electric meter down in the basement and the other half had the electric meter in the front hall. In the homes with the electric meter in the front hall, where people could see how much electricity they were using, they used 30% less electricity. Nothing else was changed. There was no difference in the cost of electricity or anything like that. It was just a different placement of where that information was available, and it changed behavior. So one of the limits to this is that knowing is not the same as paying. Cognitive dissonance is very real. The implementation of true cost accounting with regard to food would be impractical, unfavorable, and inequitable policy. Also, people have tried something similar with nutritional information on food in restaurants, and it was not particularly well received. So what about this idea of corporate transparency? That's something that has been suggested. We need to, have corporations tell us or make public exactly how much carbon each company is emitting. This stems from something that came out in 1986 when the EPA released their toxic release inventory. They made corporate contributions to air pollution public knowledge, and within a few years, air pollution was down 40%, not due to penalties, not due to regulations, but due to the social pressure and public image concerns of these corporations that were contributing to air pollution, excuse me. What about other kinds of corporate transparency? One example that we can look at is the Monsanto Chemical and Agricultural Company. Based on internal documents which have been made public, Monsanto was aware that its chemicals, its intellectual property was contributing to health problems. They paid researchers to do studies which did not find health problems and submit those to the EPA, who took those reports at face value. They simultaneously prohibited public universities from doing independent research on their intellectual property, and they successfully leaned on the government to absolve the company of responsibility for any cleanup of toxic chemical waste and its effects. Meanwhile, they were working on maintaining their desired image of being able to feed the world. Monsanto isn't alone. There are multiple corporations where this information has been released on disclosure in court cases and things like that. So thinking about this idea of transparency, the toxic release inventory was great, but regulating or requiring corporate transparency might seem like it would be helpful, but the reality is that the laws are written by lobbyists for these very corporations who try to exempt themselves, and then they're only enforced when it's politically expedient by political appointees from the industries that are subject to that regulation. There's very convoluted conflicts of interest embedded in that system. So this is my last one. All right, so to come back to this conceptual framework, human behavior is negatively impacting planetary and human health. Humanities, social sciences can help facilitate an understanding of human behavior, and systems thinking can help us organize the strategies that we can use to change it. Every field of science and humanities and indigenous knowledge must collaborate to change human behavior using every possible leverage point in these complex systems. When Diego's family asked me to help, I knew that I had to start by connecting them with their most basic physiologic and medical needs so that their future might not be as bad as their recent past. I couldn't fix the industrial agriculture-based economy that they came from. I couldn't fix the gang violence or government policies or even any of Marco and Yolanda's past personal decisions. We can't change the past, and blaming ourselves, or rich people, or corporations isn't going to reduce the harmful effects of climate change. Earth and the biosphere are pushing back. Our job at this point is to mitigate the consequences and prevent the future from getting worse. We can only do what we can do to reduce suffering. If we're smart and we work together to change human behavior, to change our own behavior, we can do a whole lot more. Anything less is palliative.
Thanks very much, Dan. And then our last speaker, last but not least in this panel, is Priya Dave, who's a medical student at Mount Sinai and a master's student in bioethics at Harvard Medical School. She's part of the Harvard Climate Leaders Program for professional students, and she serves on the leadership team for Radiologists for a Sustainable Future. She'll be spending the next year creating a climate justice curriculum for healthcare professionals in her role as a Sadler Fellow. But in the meantime, her paper this afternoon is called Green Space Ethics. Priya.
Hi all, so thank you so much for the opportunity to be here, and I've really enjoyed communicating with Victoria over the past month. She's been incredible and very helpful. So the title of my talk today is on urban green space ethics. And basically the way I came to thinking about urban green spaces was my role as a medical student. So I go to medical school in New York City, which is right next to Central Park. And a lot of the patients that we see there are, we advise them to exercise, to get out into the urban green spaces, but I found that there might be some barriers to access. And I was curious about the barriers to access of urban green spaces. How can we design green spaces and systems that accommodate all patients from all backgrounds? So I'm going to start out by defining what is an urban green space. So in land use and planning, an urban green space is an open space, and these are areas reserved for any green life. So there are parks, but they can also be areas wherever you see trees or gardens. So I want to ask you guys and ask you to turn to a neighbor and state to your neighbor where your favorite green space is and what it is. All right, so thank you guys for sharing with one another. So now we're gonna get into and start thinking about the ethical issues that arise with some green spaces, because the reality is that within green spaces, not everyone shares the benefits and harms equitably. So we're gonna get into green space ethics. All right, so why is green space ethics important? So studies show that by the year 2050, about 70% of individuals will be living in urban areas. This means that the most convenient access points to nature will be urban green spaces. Now, urban green spaces have many benefits. There's positive mental health benefits. They foster social cohesion. There's positive physical health benefits. And they serve for climate change mitigation. So they're extremely important assets to the city. And we're going to zoom back before we start talking about the ethics of green spaces to kind of the historical underpinnings of green spaces. So this is the green space that was right next to my home for a while, a Central Park. And there was a region of Central Park known as Seneca Village. It was a thriving neighborhood, mostly for people of color. And that village got completely marginalized and erased for the construction of Central Park. So some green spaces have been formed and built on systemic inequities. And studies show that to this day, several groups are excluded from green spaces. In fact, those with lower socioeconomic status and communities of color benefit from or have less access to urban green spaces. So the ethical questions surrounding green spaces, and the way I like to frame green spaces, is who has the moral status? Who are we considering when we are creating such green spaces? And I think the three main ethical questions, and there are many more beyond this, are the moral status of animals, the distributive justice considerations surrounding our current generations, and the considerations surrounding climate change and ethical considerations of our future generations. So I'd like you guys to go back to the green space that you mentioned and think about who has access to the green spaces, who was occupying the green area that you had described to your neighbor before. And unfortunately, there has been many studies show that there are lines of cleavage within income, as well as race and socioeconomic status in terms of barriers and access to green space. There's also safety considerations. Just because we are establishing a green space in an area does not mean that an individual is more likely to go there, because green spaces, especially in areas with lower socioeconomic status, are less safe. And then another consideration, too, with the emergence of green spaces and with our building of green spaces is that of gentrification. And so these are images of the Chelsea High Line and then a green space in Chicago. And the issue with both of these areas were when the green space emerged, the prices of the housing surrounding these green spaces increased. And that led to displacement of populations of lower socioeconomic status. All right, so those are some of the distributive justice considerations that we have with green spaces for our current generations. However, I also would like to next go to the moral status of animals and the moral status of non-human species. So we had with Jordan's talk earlier, she mentioned Leopold's land ethic, which was incredible. And we also should consider, in terms of the land ethic, the role of Homo sapiens as a part of the community and not a dominant force within the community. And so Leopold's land ethic asks us to consider ourselves as a part of the biotic community. And so this comes to the moral status of animals within our urban green spaces. And I think this is a question that a lot of times goes ignored or is understated in terms of, should we restore our natural landscapes? What should the roles of animals be? Should we allow for invasive species within our green spaces? And what sorts of herbicides or fertilizers do we use? And what implications do those have on animals? And there have been many prominent examples of this sort of thinking, and especially within New York City's Central Park, there's been spottings of coyotes. And so you wonder, what is the moral status of this? Are wild animals hacking life in the city? And what do you think of these sorts of headlines that are in the media portraying the animals that we coexist with within our urban green spaces? So this is a moral question of, can we exist and should we coexist with animals within our green spaces? All right, and then finally, we went over distributive justice considerations for our current generations. We went over considerations for non-human species, but I think the theme of this topic and the theme of this presentation is on climate change and planetary health, so the moral status of our future generations with climate change. So we know that green spaces have many benefits for climate mitigation. First and foremost, climate change will result in heat islands, and green spaces can mitigate the temperature and effects of these sorts of heat islands. They can absorb rainfalls. They can protect from rising seas and coastal levels. And so how are we going to distribute the benefits of green spaces for our future generations? And so we have implementation of climate resiliency measures within green spaces. Maybe some of you guys have noted these within your city, but these are just a few examples. And where are they taking place? And so you might notice, and I think in multiple cities, there are barriers, funding barriers to implementing climate-ready resiliency measures. And so a lot of these resiliency measures are taking place in communities with higher socioeconomic status, leaving communities with vulnerable populations less protected from the implications of climate change. All right, so we've talked about these moral status and ethical considerations. So moving forward, what should we do about this? What ethical solutions and what justice consideration, or how can our justice considerations mobilize our future actions? So first, we should take a bottom-up approach. And green spaces are great. I think we all would agree that we want to increase the amount of green spaces in our cities. However, we can spotlight into a problem with this approach, spotlighting into Detroit, Michigan, where the city had funded large initiatives to plant trees and create more green spaces within Detroit, but the residents actually pushed back. And about 20% of them placed non-tree planting orders for the city. Now, why was this? And there were these two researchers, and Christine Carmichael was the lead of the team. She actually sat down with the Detroit residents and found that Earlier in their history, around 1967, the city of Detroit was cutting down trees at rapid levels. And so they had a relationship of distrust with the cities and a distrust with trees that led to this sort of skepticism. So taking a bottom-up approach like Christine Carmichael did and really questioning what the residents want and how they want trees to be planted and what their perception of the trees and green spaces will be important. Second consideration is what we plant and where we plant it. And so actually, what I found very interesting is that there are male and certain species of trees are male and female. And our urban planners actually plant more male species of trees within cities and within green spaces. And this is because they produce less litter. And however, they do produce more pollen, and pollen leads to exacerbating chronic health conditions. And so we can critically question, what are we planting? There are also tree equity measures, and so you can go in and type in your zip code on this treeequity.com score, and you can see what the indication of tree equity is and how the trees are distributed within your cities. All right, investing in green spaces will be an important measure as well. The Build Back Better Act even had $2.5 billion proposed to boost tree equity within cities. Multiple organizations are also invested in this issue. And then also community engagement and involvement. And I think a lot of us in this room probably agree that the messenger is more important than the message a lot of the times. And so partnering with communities, and I've been very interested recently in this researcher, her name is Beverly Wright, and she's proposed this communiversity model in which she actively pushes us to collaborate with communities. And I'm gonna challenge myself to try and include a member from a socioeconomically vulnerable community or somebody who I'm doing work on behalf of in every one of my projects as a co-author. So I think that could be a great start to building this community engagement and involvement within our spaces of research. All right, and so I also want to address one more point. That was the conclusion of my presentation. But I also have been very curious, or I often get the question, where does healthcare come in? So I'm a medical student working in this area. And I think the healthcare community is also very, very invested in climate change, in mitigating the impacts of climate change. As you can see, there's numerous articles that have appeared recently in our major publications about climate change. And we have a lot of different climate conferences. So I put this example right here because our radiology conference this year, AUR conference, the theme was climate change. However, I feel like a lot of the times we as healthcare do our work in bubbles and we do our work in isolation. So I really appreciate the invitation for me from a medical community to join and present in a humanities conference. I would love to see more humanities-focused individuals at our medical conferences presenting on climate change and climate-related issues as well. So please submit your abstracts there. All right, so thank you very much. This is my list of references, and I appreciate your time.
Well, thanks very much. We have about just over half an hour for questions, and the magnificent Victoria has offered to walk the mic around. So, questions? Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so my questions are for Daniel, actually. The two things I wanted to point out is that Maslow's hierarchy of needs looks really great when you first look at it. But when I worked with people who really did have, and when I work with people who really do have food security and extreme health security issues like being, HIV positive without medication and seroconverting and things like that, you often choose to give up one thing on Maslow's bottom layer of hierarchy for something else, right? So I will give up eating in order to get privacy, right? Or I will, so I think Maslow's hierarchy is kind of comforting because for some of us, because we think that, well, if we just get that bottom level, everything will be sort of scaffolded up. And you and I already chatted a bit about this, but I just wanted to bring us back to that moment in the hospital when I'm telling the doctors, okay, keeping this young man biologically alive is not doing it for him. He needs a meaningful life. So he's on ARVs, right? But where is his hope for ongoing employment? And I sometimes think that Maslow's hierarchy can be damaging because it doesn't allow us to realize how people can be earning a living and living in a lower or middle class or even upper class environment and not actually feel emotionally or spiritually fulfilled and have some very, very negative addiction and health outcomes. So I just wanted to, and I have to be honest, I really believed in Maslow's hierarchy until I saw that the poorest of the poor will and in the most extreme sort of conditions of what we've been calling vulnerability, will sometimes resist that hierarchy and go, no, actually, privacy is more important to me than food or medicine. So I guess that's enough of a question right now.
Yes, thank you very much. And what I'll say is I completely agree, and I have seen many times that people will trade things on multiple layers of the hierarchy for something in a layer above or a layer below it. A big part of what we do in palliative care is when there's no great options due to medical situation, how do we make trade-offs? What do we give up in order to achieve more meaning in whatever remains of life? And so people will routinely forego artificial nutrition and hydration in order to maintain that sense of meaning, so that they can feel integrated as a person, as a human being, going into the end of their life.
This is for Priya. Thank you for the presentation and for all the suggestions. I was wondering if you might speak to another way of greening urban areas that might actually have more of an impact on health, which is urban farming, which is tricky. I mean, there's a lot of urban farming in Detroit, and there are real worries that it has contributed to gentrification in those areas. On the other hand, when the land is owned either by the city or by someone who's willing to, cede it over to the farms, it does have an effect on the health of the people in the area. So just thought maybe you could talk some about that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think I focused definitely my presentation a lot on green spaces outside of gardens. But that's, I think gardens have been noted for their ability to combat food insecurity as well as the climate, in the face of climate change. And so I think that's a great measure as well. And I'm not too familiar with, and I have not researched too much about the structure of gardens, but I do know there are a lot of cities that are looking into urban forests and incorporating kind of elements of gardens and forests together within cities, because I think trees ultimately are what mitigate the impacts of climate change. And so I think it'll be interesting to see and to have a hybrid model of both.
My question is for Jamie. I was wondering, it's a clarification question. I'm interested in what you say is the ontological aspect of the complexity of climate displacement. I was hoping that you could say a bit more about that.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks. So I suppose what I mean by that is that, at least from the kind of reading I've been doing in the migration studies literature on the ways in which climate change impacts upon displacement, is that the kind of complexity that we see in sort of multiple causes combining is not, I suppose the idea is that there's something that's kind of more than the sum of its parts, if you like. So it's not that we can just say, say 30% of this movement was caused by climate change impacts and 60% was caused by this and the remaining 10% by something else, and we can kind of disentangle it, right? So you get situations where, climate change impacts aren't kind of reducible to their individual components. So I guess I'm using ontological, not in the sense that I think it's sometimes used in some of the philosophical literature, but that's the way I've kind of seen it described in the migration studies literature there. So I guess there might be some kind of like terminological questions, I guess, around whether that's the right kind of way of describing what's going on there. But I've kind of picked that up from those kinds of literatures, I suppose.
Thank you.
Thanks. This is also for Jamie. Jamie, I was wondering whether you had thought, I really appreciate all of the complexity you're bringing in. So this is not one of these critique questions. This is an open question. But I do wonder about the way in which we think about, for example, boat refugees as going from one place to another. And displacement always strikes me that way. There's always a kind of envisioned fleeing and an envisioned haven. So my experience that I go back to in sub-Saharan Africa, which I may or may not be relevant, but brings me to a question, and that is a question: is there a problem of seeing displaced people as on a trajectory, in the sense that a lot of economic refugees in sub-Saharan Africa go backwards and forwards and crisscross and don't have a trajectory from X to Y? So in my worst vision of what climate displacement looks like, it doesn't actually look like a trajectory from one place to another place. It looks more like a desperate hit and miss game of snakes and ladders, if that makes sense. And I was wondering if you had conceptualized that in your understanding of the complexities of displacement.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so I mean, there are different ways people talk about this. So I've used the term displacement today, but one other term that I think is actually maybe more helpful is mobilities, I think, right? So it's true, I think, that displacement has this, conjures this image, I suppose, of people fleeing, often in a kind of sudden and desperate way from one place to another, one place which is kind of painted as being a kind of site of disaster, to another place which is a place of refuge or something. And you're right to point out that that's not always the case, right? Sometimes that is the case, but that's certainly not always the case when climate change and mobility sort of interact. So I think I mentioned very briefly in the talk that one of the ways in which different factors can affect the ways in which people move is by making people immobile when it would be good for them to be mobile in some ways, right? So often it's the poorest who don't have the financial capacity to be able to engage in kind of migration projects, who are stuck in hazardous places. As you point out, sort of sometimes the kinds of mobility that we see are seasonal or circular in nature, right? So especially where climate change impacts kind of affect seasonal patterns of rainfall, for example, and people who would have otherwise engaged in sort of subsistence farming do things like take up wage labor for part of the year in a city and then return and iterate that process over a number of years and so on. So I think, I suppose there's a danger in the term displacement in that it might sort of conjure up an image that I suppose I don't want to be conjured up, which is the idea that displacement is always a kind of, or mobility is always a kind of negative outcome. So there's I think what's sometimes called a kind of sedentarist bias in the migration studies literature, which is the idea that we should see migration or displacement as kind of abnormal in the way. So the norm, if you like, is a kind of sedentary community in some way. And lots of people have pointed out that that's kind of contains within it an implicit value judgment, which is probably not justified, but also just doesn't really describe the lives of many people, right? So there's plenty of people around the world who have lived traditionally mobile livelihoods, And their mobility is also being affected by the impacts of climate change. So you have nomadic herders, for example, in the Sahel region of Africa, whose sort of traditional patterns of mobility are being disrupted, and so on. And so I suppose, yeah, perhaps displacement isn't the right kind of language, but I want what I'm talking about in general to cover this kind of broader idea of mobility.
Thank you.
So, Jamie, I'll just build a little bit on Rosa's question, which is, I noticed in your 5 categories in your pluralist approach, 2 are aggregates. They're not about individuals, they're about communities or states. So community relocation and territorial sovereignty, whereas labor migration, internal displacement, and refugee-like situations are all individuals who are being, as opposed to communities or loss of sovereignty. So I wonder if you could reflect on whether or not we need different types of approaches to the individualist versus, for lack of a better term, aggregate approaches. So number 1. Number 2, you may have to also, and here's another thing I just wanted to get your feedback on. In some of these instances, particularly labor migration, we know that a lot of labor migration is not the entire family. It's often one individual in the family, usually the male in the family, not always. So that it's not migration per se, in that some of the family stays, quote, in place, but their life is dramatically impacted by the fact that the person who's leaving in order to go and earn a living isn't physically there. So I know that you're trying to get a more pluralist approach, but if you could speak to some of these differences and how you're thinking about them and what we might think about them, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, sure thing. That's great. So I think I'll start with the second question about labor migration. So that's absolutely right. So in the book project that I'm working on, I have a chapter on this where I look at the case of drought-related migration in Ethiopia, where what we see is precisely that migration amongst men increased and migration amongst women decreased. And that's because in lots of rural Ethiopia, it's men who take up wage labor in cities, but it's also women's mobility is often associated with moving for marriage. And so women who were worse off because of climate-related droughts were unable to engage in marriage-related moves. And you're right that when predominantly men engage in kind of seasonal labor migration or permanent labor migration, it's not just them who's affected, right? This is something that labor economists view it in terms of like the household level, I suppose. And so I think this is a kind of central part of how we should think about what the normative claims that are at stake here are, right? So the kind of open question I have about labor migration is, given that we see people engaging in this form of labor migration as a kind of bottom-up strategy of adaptation to climate change, and given what we know about its potential effectiveness, so we know, for example, that when people do engage in labor migration and they send remittances from abroad, say, that can have quite a significant impact on people's adaptive capacity back home. So it can be really positive in some ways, but also it does create these incredibly difficult household dynamics, I suppose, right? Where suddenly you're put in a position in this family where you have to make a decision, right, about what to do, whether to engage in this kind of labor migration, which means leaving part of your family behind. And this isn't just a decision that people make on the basis of a kind of pure cost-benefit analysis, obviously, right? So there's whole kinds of things feeding into this decision. And I suppose one of the open questions, I don't yet have a kind of clear picture about what exactly we should say about this case, but one of the open questions I have is like, to what extent should we be supporting people engaging in this kind of labor migration, and to what extent should we be altering the background circumstances such that people don't have to make these kinds of decisions? So obviously, I kind of incline towards the latter, but I also think that in the here and now, there are real questions to be asked about. I don't think the answer is to say, we should prevent people from moving because of these kinds of dynamics, because of these kinds of tensions that it creates. So I think there's a kind of genuine dilemma there, which is worth exploring more, which I hope to do in more detail in future work, I suppose. So on the community versus individual level focused. So that's right. So that's one of the ways in which we might kind of draw distinctions between the different kinds of cases. So some of them, in particular, community relocation and territorial sovereignty, are going to involve normative claims that arise at the kind of community level. So in the case of small island states, those are kind of political claims about jurisdictional authority, self-determination, and in the community relocation case, there are often questions about the sort of shared social and cultural practices that community members engage in together. So one of the great fears, I think, in a lot of contexts of community relocation is that it's going to fail and that community members are going to end up dispersed. They're going to be moving at different times to different places. They're going to end up as a kind of diaspora. And I think, there's a deep philosophical question about whether these kinds of claims can be reduced to individual level claims that people have. I have this claim in virtue of my membership in a particular social collective, but nonetheless it's a kind of individual claim, or whether they're kind of properly thought of as claims that arise at the collective level. I guess I don't really have like a considered philosophical view on that, but I think as a kind of political question, right, it's important to realize that these claims do arise at the collective level. So one of the main approaches to flood risk management is sort of retreat through voluntary buyouts of properties, and that's all pretty much conducted at the individual household level, where you'll get a grant, or you'll be able to sell your house at the cost that it would have commanded in the absence of flood risk to the government. It'll function as a buyout, enable you to move somewhere else. I think if we're looking at entire communities, then that kind of approach just misses out on these kinds of collective level considerations.
I have a question for Daniel. I really like the idea of de-addiction for thinking about planetary health. So just to go with the example that you used, just of plastics, could you spell it out a little bit? What might a de-addiction program for plastics look like?
I have no idea. That is my honest answer. I have no idea. What I'll tell you is, what we do in palliative care when we're faced with something that is absolutely seems insurmountable is that there's tremendous power in just naming it and letting it be there and say, hey, this is really tough. I have no idea how we're going to do this. What ideas do you have? And that's where we start, is the generative problem solving together. And so I think naming it for what it is and beginning to think about how we can support one another, because group therapy and group support systems is one of the pillars of addiction recovery and treatment. I think that is a tremendous first step.
Too, that kind of reminded me of the, in Boston, we've started to charge for single-use plastic bags. And now so many more people bring in fabric bags or their own bags from home. So I think de-addicting, you could put a price on potentially, and a vocal price that might be able to solve some of the issue.
More ideas from the group. The group problem solving has already started.
Yeah, just a quick comment. So I was just going to comment that I saw that Starbucks is no longer going to offer single-use cups, I think starting in 2023. So you have to either bring your own, or they will have reusable containers for purchase. So, which is an interesting move for Starbucks, of course. There's some profitability for them in that, of course. But I was intrigued, and I thought about it earlier, about what other industries could we implement that in? Like, could you do that? I mean, like, even I think it's France that they tried to do away with bottled water, and so they have free filtered water throughout different cities. I'm not sure how far that reaches, but so really just a comment, not necessarily a question.
Yeah, I was thinking about the question about de-addiction. So one of the things that I've been recommending in terms of how we approach decolonizing global health is actually a harm reduction paradigm, right? So people often criticize, so harm reduction is generated in addiction, substance abuse debates. That's where it comes from. And it's about, if this is going to happen, how do we, if mom is going to be shooting up, how do we make sure that she does so safely and doesn't infect with intravenous drug use pathogens, which are, pretty serious. So people think that it's a really bad thing. And I still defend this, and I'm still in favor of it. In places where there's no shelter for abused women, a harm reduction strategy approach to sexual assault is really, really important. And I can talk about that with other folks, but this idea that we can always be heading for the perfect is a problem. And on top of that is the idea that we can't implement harm reduction without giving up on the ideal. Now, I don't know where that comes from, and I don't know why they're mutually exclusive, because one works in a very specific level, and the other one's a long-term determinant. So this either-or thing, or the notion that harm reduction is problematic, I think needs to be just investigated a little bit. And where that came from was the question about how do we de-addict? Thank you.
Thank you very much. One thing that I would just add to the conversation is that everything about our addiction to single-use plastics, to fossil fuels, everything like that, the system that is currently in place that has made those addictions possible is already using every single one of those leverage points to promote stability of the system. And so you really have to start thinking about it. Okay, what are the little nudges that I'm being used? Like, it's, that Keurig cup is just right there. I'm, bleary-eyed when I first wake up, and I want a cup of coffee. Look, how did they know that I want that right there? That's amazing. So it's that type of nudge that that pushes us back into this system. And so unless we start to think about every single one of those leverage points and how we can flip those levers in the other direction that de-escalates the addiction or transitions it onto healthier alternatives, I think we're going to just keep falling back into the same system.
So I have a question for Michelle. I'm not very knowledgeable about this, but I'm assuming that Habitat for Humanities homes aren't signed. Is that correct?
They are, because they're mortgaged.
Aha. Okay.
So they're not free houses.
They're
so the
not free
people have
houses.
to be able to qualify for a mortgage.
Gotcha.
So the poorest of poor don't qualify for Habitat.
So are there any houses that aren't signed, that aren't mortgaged? So, the Red Cross sign, the little plaque saying this house was, are there any that are built that aren't signed? And if there are, what kind of impact does it have not to have it signed?
Right, so there are, and I'll say I don't have an answer to that question right now. But I do think it's something interesting to ask, because even if it's not necessarily has a sign on it, as it's being built, it will have a sign in the yard that the nonprofit is building it. So even if the plaque doesn't end up on the house, people will know that that house was built. They're also there's only like 3 to 4 different shapes of these houses, kind of like habitat houses, all look the same. So these houses all look the same. So you kind of know who ended up in one of these homes as well in that process. And so from the U.S. example, I can't tell you how people think about that. From the Sri Lanka example, it didn't necessarily depend on whether there was a sign on it or not. It was how the nonprofit interacted with the participant while they were building the house. So one of them, the money wasn't done by the international NGO. It was given to a Buddhist temple, and the Buddhist temple then worked with people, local people, let them do different. They got to, do their religious ceremonies as the house was built. They got to pick out the layout. They got to do these different decision points. And they were more happily and going to stay in their house, even though it had a little plaque on it, versus other folks who were then just assigned to a building, and this is your house, and you had no choice over it. And usually they didn't fit your family or your needs or your culture or anything like that.
There are a few organizations I know of that go into communities and as best they can use local craftspeople to build these houses, and also are committed to developing skills of how to build houses while they're building the houses. Mm-hmm. Do you have any experience with those, and does that make a difference when that happens?
I don't have as much experience with those, and so I'll kind of change the question, because one of the issues in this disaster space is speed, right? So if we want to get houses rebuilt as fast as possible, we'll use volunteers, but we're not going to use it as an educational workforce and try to train people into that system. So you can have volunteers like you do for Habitat that can paint and drive nails, and then you have professionals who do the electrical and that kind of stuff. But they're not going to slow down the speed to do that additional benefit of job training. Though I have seen it in Louisiana, an environmental justice group there did muck-outs at a fair living wage for parolees specifically, and started working with them on then what would be the next step after they did kind of demolition to figure out if they wanted to stay in that trade and move forward from there. But it's rare.
Michelle, I actually had a question on that theme too, which was, I was curious how this owner versus donor model differed in what the sources of labor were, and perhaps connecting that to some of Jamie's ideas about sort of mobilities of labor, and how it's tapping into or relying on mobile labor, and on that, just also how perhaps discourse about who provides the labor may be folding into these discussions.
Thanks, John. Interesting question. I think if we think about probably an owner-driven model is going to be usually paid labor, but sometimes it might be the owner doing labor themselves, or having a friend or a brother or somebody do the labor in that kind of way, versus in the donor-driven model, not in the international cases, right? But here in the U.S., those are built by volunteers. Oftentimes it's, your youth church group goes off to a disaster area for a week, and they get to step in there and do that. So for the labor market, this raises kind of interesting questions of that. We know that post-Katrina, the Hispanic population grew dramatically because of the increase in labor. Labor used to build houses came from Hispanic populations moving in. And that's in the paid market or underpaid market in many ways. And then we also see sometimes in communities the conflict then rises from the construction companies who want to be paid and want to hire out labor for these activities, and they can't because there's a free model right here on the other side, done with high school kids or grandmas and grandpas or whoever has a good feeling that day to go help rebuild. And I will say in the They usually do a good job, but there are cases of, I've tried to lay a laminate floor before. The first time I did it, it does not look great, and it's going to need redone in a year. And that's the same thing that happens in these homes, is that you often have a variety of mistakes and things that they're to code, but they're not quite the best.
We have enough time for one more question, maybe? Maybe then I can take the opportunity to steal a question. So this is a bit left field, and it's for Jamie. So I work in animal ethics. I was really interested in your kind of multiple models of kind of different forms of migration. And clearly climate change is having similar kinds of impacts on animals, and they're moving in very different kinds of ways. So they're like slow moving because it's getting warmer, and those populations are kind of moving north in the northern hemisphere. Then you've got kind of animals that migrate every year, where they will change by a week each time and then get out of sync with other food sources where they're arriving at. And then you've got kind of sea level changes and animals moving, birds and animals moving on shores. So I thought your model might be really interesting for thinking about animal population movements. But also I was wondering whether you thought that there might be any kinds of things that humans ought to do to help or not hinder animals that are moving because of climate change.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have to confess I haven't thought about it at all. So this is a bit like off the cuff, I
said
suppose.
It was left field.
But yeah, I mean, I guess, so one thing I've heard discussed is kind of assisted migration of species as a response to climate change. I think that's something that as a policy response people talk about doing. I don't know enough about it to say whether I think it's a useful way of thinking about how we should think about the mobility of animals in climate, in the context of climate change. I mean, I guess my general sort of approach to this would be to think, okay, well, let's look at what's happening, right? What the changing dynamics of non-human animal migration are as a result of climate change, and what the problems that especially human action is kind of creating here. So if it's the case, for example, that we need to do certain things to enable some non-human animals to change their migratory patterns, say, I don't know, I've seen lots of pictures floating around of kind of, green bridges for animals that are made over highways and that kind of thing. I mean, yeah, maybe that's the kind of thing, the kind of intervention that I would be interested in looking at further. I guess I'd be a little bit worried, just a kind of, maybe this is just kind of my own disposition, but I'd be a bit too worried about kind of dramatic interventions with the kind of aim of assisting non-human animals, because the kinds of, I guess the ecosystems in which they're operating are incredibly complex, right? So it's difficult for us to know, I guess, what the kinds of interventions are that would actually be helpful, right? So that I think there's also a danger of a kind of human hubris here in our interventions as well. But that's a great question. I'd like to think about it a bit more.
Great, thanks very much. That was really interesting.